Did your family walk on eggshells or explode without warning?
When people talk about family holidays, they usually imagine warmth, laughter, maybe a little chaos with kids running around or relatives telling the same old stories. But for me, Easter has always been something else entirely. Because it has always been the stage for my brother, Daniel, to remind everyone in the room where he stood in life and where, in his mind, I did not, and this year was no different, except that it turned into something none of them expected. We were sitting at the table, everyone busy piling ham and potatoes on their plates, when Daniel, with that smug half-smile he always wore when he was about to drop one of his little grenades, looked at me across the table and said, "Must be nice not having a real job, loud enough for everyone to hear, but casual enough that he could act like he was just joking if anyone called him out." For a split second, I felt that old sting in my chest, the one I'd been feeling since we were kids, the one that whispered that maybe he was right, that maybe I didn't measure up, but instead of answering, I just looked down at my plate and let the silence wrap around me, because I already knew something no one else at that table knew, and I was willing to wait for it to surface. Daniel has always had this talent for slipping insults into family gatherings the way other people pass the salt, and the truth is, for most of my life, I let it get to me. I can't tell you how many Thanksgivings or birthdays ended with me crying in the bathroom because he found some way to turn my choices into a punchline. He had the kind of career my parents bragged about to their friends, steady, high-paying, with a title you could explain in one neat sentence, while I was the one they described with awkward pauses, fumbling for phrases like, "she's working on her own thing," or "she's very independent," which was just their polite way of saying they had no clue if I was wasting my life or not. Every time Daniel leaned back in his chair with that satisfied look, I wanted to snap back, to list all the nights I had worked until sunrise, to throw my bank statements in his face, to tell him that the world wasn't as simple as his little bubble of promotions and quarterly bonuses, but I never did, partly because I didn't want to give him the satisfaction and partly because deep down I wanted to save it for the right moment. This Easter, I kept my mouth shut, but it wasn't because I was beaten down or out of words. It was because for once I didn't need to defend myself, not anymore, and the power of knowing something he didn't gave me a kind of calm that felt new, almost addictive. I could feel my mom's eyes darting nervously between us, probably hoping I wouldn't turn the dinner into another battle, and my dad cleared his throat like he always did when tension was building. But I just sipped my water and let Daniel keep basking in the attention he thought he earned. Inside, though, I was replaying the meetings, the contracts, the signatures, and the phone calls that had taken place over the past few months, and I almost had to stop myself from smiling, because the irony was too perfect. For years, my brother acted like my work didn't count because it didn't look like his, because it didn't come with a boss or a corporate badge or an HR department handing out branded mugs at orientation, and honestly, there were times I questioned myself too. It's not easy when the people closest to you measure your worth by how easily they can explain you to others. But while Daniel was perfecting his little digs, I was quietly building something, putting together a team, taking risks, making mistakes, learning from them, and slowly turning an idea that started in my apartment into something big enough to make even the kind of company Daniel worked for take notice. That was the part he didn't see. The part one didn't broadcast, because I learned early that if I talked too much about what I was doing, the family would roll their eyes and change the subject. So when he leaned in with that sneer and delivered his line, "Must be nice not having a real job," I felt the weight of every past dinner where I had sat in silence, every moment where I had swallowed down words that would have just bounced off him anyway. And I decided to let it go one more time, not out of weakness, but out of patience. I didn't need to win the room in that second, because I already knew the win was coming, and when it did, it wouldn't be because I argued louder, it would be because the truth had a way of slipping out at the most unexpected times, and it would land harder than anything I could have said in that moment. And then it happened, right when Daniel was still smirking and my mom was nervously changing the subject. My grandmother, who is sharp in ways that sometimes cut right through all the posturing, leaned forward, tilted her head, and asked in the most innocent voice, "Didn't your firm just buy her startup?" The words seemed to hang in the air like a dropped glass, and for the first time in my life, I watched my brother's face lose all its smugness in an instant, because suddenly the joke wasn't funny anymore. And everyone at the table realized that the story they had been telling themselves about me wasn't the truth at all. But that was just the beginning, because what they didn't know yet was how long this had been building, how much I had gone through to get there, and how much sweeter the silence felt now that the tables had turned. And, trust me, I wasn't done telling this story, because what happened before that Easter dinner is what really explains how we got there. If you've ever grown up with a sibling who seemed to fit every mold your parents and relatives quietly, or sometimes not so quietly, wished you would fit into, then you'll understand what it felt like to live in Daniel's shadow. Because from the time we were kids, he was the one who always got the recognition, the awards, the pats on the back, and I was the one who got the polite nods, the backhanded compliments, and the reminders to try harder next time. And while on the surface those things sound small, when you live with that imbalance year after year, it shapes the way you see yourself, even if you fight it with everything you have. I can still remember family gatherings when I was in high school, where Daniel would breeze in with some new story about his internship, or his perfect grades, or the summer program he got into. And everyone would light up as though they were in the presence of a future senator, while I sat there trying to talk about the art project I was proud of, or the part-time job I had taken on to buy myself a little independence, only to be met with tight smiles that said, "That's nice, but it's not the same." By the time we were both in college, the pattern was locked in place, and no matter what I did, Daniel always seemed to hold the better hand, the one everyone respected, while mine was always treated like a temporary distraction from the real paths in life. He majored in finance, which made our parents beam with pride, because in their eyes that meant stability, respectability, and guaranteed success, while I chose communications, something I was genuinely passionate about. But in their minds it was the equivalent of throwing my future into a wishing well. Every holiday break, Daniel would arrive home with stories about internships at firms with names everyone recognized, while I came home with tales of projects I was working on, professors who inspired me, and new ideas I wanted to try out. And each time I could feel the air shift slightly, the way it does when people are trying to be polite but secretly unimpressed. As we got older, nothing really changed. If anything, the gap widened, because Daniel's path was so straightforward, so easily explainable to anyone who asked, while mine was messy, filled with experiments, risks, and jobs that didn't come with a neat title. At family dinners, Daniel always seemed to find a way to steer the conversation back to himself, dropping little markers of his achievements, promotions, raises, deals closed, and each time he did, our parents' faces lit up with pride, while mine, if they even turned toward me, carried an expression that said, "We hope you'll figure it out soon." Even my friends noticed it when they came around. They'd comment afterward about how much attention Daniel got and how quiet I became in comparison, and though I brushed it off, inside I hated the way it made me feel invisible. The hardest part wasn't just Daniel's arrogance, though that certainly didn't help. It was the way everyone else seemed to validate it. The way his digs landed, because they were backed by a history of everyone treating him like the successful one and me like the one still trying to find her footing. I can remember one Thanksgiving in particular, years before Easter Showdown, when Daniel made a crack about how I was playing entrepreneur, and instead of defending me, my dad actually laughed, like it was the most accurate description in the world. And I excused myself to the bathroom where I sat on the edge of the tub, staring at my reflection, wondering if maybe they were right. Those moments left marks that didn't fade quickly, and even when I grew tougher, even when I told myself I didn't need their validation, it didn't erase the years of being dismissed. But here's the thing that none of them realized. While Daniel was busy curating his image, always making sure his career looked perfect from the outside, I was slowly learning something much more important, which was how to survive being underestimated. Every slight, every insult, every time they looked past me, it fueled me in ways I didn't even understand at the time, because it made me stubborn, it made me unwilling to fold, and it made me more determined than ever to prove that I was not just someone dabbling in hobbies, but someone who could build something that mattered. They thought their comments were putting me in my place, but really they were building the fire I needed to keep going, and that fire never went out. I won't lie and say it didn't hurt, because it did, and there were plenty of nights when I lay awake, wondering if maybe I was chasing something impossible, wondering if it would be easier to just take the kind of job they would all respect so I wouldn't have to keep carrying this weight of disappointment. But each time I came close to giving in, something inside me said no, something whispered that if I gave up, Daniel would always be the one who won by default, not because he was better, but because I stopped trying, and I couldn't live with that. So I kept pushing, even when no one was watching, even when the only person who believed in me was me, and while Daniel sat back comfortably in his corporate world, I kept chipping away at something that, one day, would change everything. And that's what they never saw coming, because when you've been underestimated for long enough, you learn that the most powerful move is not to fight for attention in the moment, but to build something undeniable in the background. Something so solid that when it finally surfaces, no one can laugh it off or dismiss it anymore. At every family gathering, Daniel thought he was winning by making me look small, but what he didn't realize was that I was quietly building the very thing that would one day force everyone at that table to see me differently. And trust me, when that day finally came, the silence was louder than any applause could have been. When people look back at success stories, they always seem to focus on the part where everything finally worked out, the headlines, the buyouts, the moment when the underdog finally has their big win, but what they rarely talk about is the long, unglamorous years in between, when every decision feels like a gamble, when people you trust quietly wonder if you've lost your mind, and when you spend night after night convincing yourself that you're not wasting your life chasing something that doesn't exist, and that is exactly where I lived for a very long time. After college, when Daniel walked into his first polished office job with benefits and business cards that made our parents proud, I was still sitting on the floor of my apartment surrounded by half-finished ideas, scribbled notes, and the kind of chaos that doesn't look like anything to anyone else, but in my head was the beginning of something real, even if no one else could see it. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't easy, because while my brother was celebrating his steady salary increases and promotions, I was draining what little savings I had to keep my dream alive, skipping dinners out, taking side jobs that had nothing to do with what I wanted just so I could pay rent, and hearing over and over again the same tired questions about when I would finally get serious. Even my friends, as supportive as they tried to be, would occasionally slip and ask if I ever thought about just applying somewhere normal, and each time it stung, because it reminded me that no one, not even the people closest to me, really believed this could turn into something more than a hobby. My parents didn't say it outright, but the way they asked about my projects instead of my work said everything, as if the language itself carried the assumption that I wasn't doing something that counted. What kept me going was not confidence, because if I am honest, confidence came and went like waves, but stubbornness, that deep refusal to be defined by someone else's expectations. I told myself if I could just get one client, if I could just survive another month, if I could just prove the model worked once, then maybe the rest would follow. And sometimes it did, in tiny increments that no one else noticed, like the first time someone paid me for an idea I had written down in a notebook months earlier, or the first time I hired someone, not because I wanted to look like a boss, but because I literally couldn't keep up with the workload on my own. Those moments were invisible to my family, who only cared about traditional markers of success, but to me they were proof that I wasn't crazy, that this thing I was building actually had weight. Of course, there were also the crushing lows, the times when a deal fell apart at the last second, when a client ghosted me and took half of my month's income with them. When I stared at my bank account and wondered if it was irresponsible to keep pushing forward instead of applying for a job with a steady paycheck like everyone thought I should. Those were the nights when Daniel's voice echoed in my head, not because he was there, but because every insult he had ever thrown at me replayed like a tape I couldn't turn off, reminding me that failure would prove him right. And maybe that's why I kept going, not just out of ambition but out of spite, because I couldn't bear to hand him the satisfaction of being able to say, "I told you so." Over time, though, the little victories started to add up, and the chaos in my apartment turned into a small office, and the part-time contractors turned into full-time employees. And the thing everyone dismissed as a hobby started to gain traction that even I hadn't dared imagine in the early days. It wasn't flashy, and I didn't parade it in front of my family, partly because I had learned that talking about it only opened the door for more skepticism, but also because I liked the idea of keeping it quiet, letting it grow under the radar until it was too big for anyone to ignore. While Daniel was busy boasting about his quarterly bonuses, I was signing agreements that would lay the groundwork for growth, and even though I never said it out loud, I knew that if things kept moving the way they were, one day I wouldn't just be keeping up with him. I would be ahead of him. And then came the moment that changed everything, the moment that validated every sleepless night, every risk I had taken, every time I had swallowed my pride in front of my family and kept pushing anyway. The day I got the call that a major firm, one of those very firms Daniel practically worshipped, was interested in acquiring my company. I remember sitting there after I hung up, the room so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat, realizing that the tables were about to turn in a way I could never have scripted, because the firm wasn't just any firm, it was the one Daniel worked for. The same one he bragged about at every dinner, the one that represented everything he thought made him better than me. I didn't tell anyone right away, not even my closest friends, because I wanted to hold on to that secret a little longer, to savor the knowledge that for once I wasn't the one on the defensive. That for once I was holding the card that would shift the entire narrative. The deal took months, with lawyers and endless meetings and paperwork that made my head spin, but I sat through every single one with a calm I had never felt before, because I knew exactly what was at stake. And I knew exactly what it would mean when it finally went through. And when it did, when the signatures were on the page and the company I built with nothing but stubbornness and scraps officially became theirs, I realized I didn't need to say a word to Daniel, because sooner or later, the truth would reach him, and when it did, it would land harder than any comeback I could have given at the dinner table. That knowledge was enough to keep me quiet, enough to keep me patient, because I understood that the most satisfying revenge isn't loud. It isn't about shouting over someone or proving your point in the moment. It's about waiting until the truth comes out on its own, in a way no one can deny, and knowing that when it does, you don't have to lift a finger. And that was exactly where I stood, silently waiting for Easter, where the timing would be perfect and the reveal would be unforgettable. By the time the negotiations between my company and Daniel's firm became serious, I had already grown used to keeping secrets from my family, not because I wanted to hide anything out of shame, but because I had learned over years of being doubted that it was far better to let results speak for themselves than to hand people half-formed details they could twist into new reasons to dismiss me. So when I walked into those first meetings with their executives, I carried the weight of knowing that no one around the Easter table would have believed me even if I told them. The process itself was grueling, filled with late-night calls, endless red-lined contracts, and the kind of high-stakes conversations that would have terrified me years earlier. But now, after years of surviving on my own, I found myself calm, almost detached, as though I knew deep down that this was not only the right moment for my company, but also the moment my entire life had been building toward. What struck me most throughout those negotiations was the irony of the situation, because Daniel's firm approached us with the kind of urgency that made it clear they needed us far more than we needed them. And every time one of their executives praised our innovation or complimented the way I had structured the business, I thought about the countless family dinners where Daniel mocked me for not having a real job. And I realized just how satisfying it was to hear that validation, not from people who loved me out of obligation, but from people who had no reason to flatter me unless they meant it. Of course, I couldn't say a word to Daniel, even when we were in the same room, even when he dropped casual lines about the big projects he was working on, because the confidentiality agreements kept me silent, but sitting across from him, knowing what I knew, gave me a power I had never felt before, one that grew stronger each time he tried to position himself as the authority in our family. There were moments during the process when the stress nearly overwhelmed me, when the deal looked like it might collapse under the weight of competing interests and egos, and in those moments I thought about how easy it would be to walk away, to keep my independence, to avoid entangling my company with a firm that carried Daniel's fingerprints. But each time I reminded myself of the bigger picture, that this was not just about money or status, It was about leverage, about rewriting a story that had been told at my expense for far too long. When the final papers were signed and the acquisition became official, I sat alone in my office for a long time, staring at the documents that proved beyond any doubt that the company I had built from nothing had been deemed valuable enough for one of the biggest players in the industry to buy. And I thought about how that single fact would eventually ripple through my family in ways no speech or argument ever could. The hardest part was staying patient, because as much as I wanted to pick up the phone and tell Daniel directly, to watch his smug expression crack in real time, I knew that the most powerful moment would come when he found out, not from me, but in the natural course of conversation, when he least expected it, and when I would not have to lift a finger to make the blow land. So I waited, letting him carry on with his usual digs and casual put-downs, even as he had no idea that behind the scenes his firm had spent millions acquiring the very thing he loved to belittle. Each time he opened his mouth to remind me that my projects were not a career, I bit back the urge to smile, because inside I knew the countdown had already begun, and sooner or later someone in the family would connect the dots, and the fallout would be far more satisfying than anything I could engineer myself. My grandmother, as it turned out, was the one who unknowingly held the match to light that fire, but even before Easter I had started to notice little hints that the truth was trickling out, the way certain colleagues of Daniel's spoke more carefully around me, or the way my name started appearing in circles that had once dismissed me. I knew the silence was building, that moment of reckoning when years of being underestimated would collide with the undeniable reality of what I had achieved, and although I told myself it was not about revenge, I cannot deny that it felt like justice. The kind that doesn't require yelling or fighting, only the quiet confidence of knowing you have already won. As Easter drew closer, I found myself oddly calm, even when Daniel's texts came in with their usual smugness, even when my parents asked once again whether I was still doing that startup thing, because I no longer felt the need to defend myself. Instead, I felt like someone who was holding a secret that would change the dynamics of the entire table once it came out, and all I had to do was sit back and wait. I didn't rehearse a speech, I didn't plan a dramatic reveal, because I knew that the power of the moment would come from my silence, from letting someone else drop the truth into the middle of the conversation, and from watching as the room shifted in an instant. That was the difference between who I used to be and who I had become. Years ago, I would have tried to shout over Daniel, to prove my worth with words that always seemed to fall flat, but now I understood that the real revenge was not in arguing, but in outlasting. In building something so undeniable that it erased the years of being dismissed without me having to lift a finger. And as I walked into my parents' house on Easter Sunday, carrying the same smile I always wore, I felt a calm anticipation humming under my skin, because I knew what was coming, I knew how it would feel when the tables finally turned, and I knew that silence, the very thing that used to make me feel powerless, was about to become my greatest weapon. Easter dinner has always carried a kind of unspoken tension for me, the kind that builds not because of the food or the holiday itself, but because everyone is crammed into one room with the same family dynamics that never seem to change. And as I sat down at the table this year, I already knew the evening was destined to unfold in the same tired rhythm as always, with Daniel dominating the conversation, my parents beaming at his every anecdote, and me left to smile politely at the edges. Except, this time I wasn't the same person I had been all those years before, because this time I had the kind of quiet knowledge that could turn the entire table upside down without me saying a single word. The meal began as expected, everyone reaching for the ham, the potatoes, the rolls, Daniel settling into his role as the star of the show with the confidence of someone who had never once doubted that his place at the center of attention was secure. And then, right on cue, he leaned across the table. With that sneer I knew so well, and delivered the line he had probably rehearsed in his head, "Must be nice not having a real job." For a moment, I felt the familiar sting, the reflexive urge to defend myself, to point out that his so-called real job was not the only definition of success, but instead of speaking, I pressed my lips together and let the words hang in the air. Because I already knew what was coming, and the satisfaction of knowing was worth more than any clever comeback I could have delivered in that moment. My parents exchanged their usual nervous glances, my dad clearing his throat as though to smooth over the awkwardness, and Daniel leaned back in his chair, proud of himself, confident that he had once again reminded everyone of the hierarchy he believed in so deeply. What none of them realized was that the hierarchy had already been shattered, that the foundation he had built his superiority on no longer existed, and that within seconds, the truth would surface in a way that even he couldn't talk his way out of. It happened so simply, so innocently, that for a second I almost didn't believe it was real. My grandmother, who had never been interested in corporate politics or in bragging about careers, set down her fork, tilted her head in that thoughtful way she always did, and asked in a tone so casual it cut sharper than any deliberate confrontation. "Didn't your firm just buy her startup?" The words were like a thunderclap in the middle of an ordinary conversation, and in that instant the room fell into a silence so heavy it seemed to press down on all of us at once. My brother's face froze, his confident expression collapsing as the weight of her words sank in, and I sat there watching, my heart pounding, not because I was nervous, but because I had finally arrived at the moment I had been waiting for all these years. The silence stretched longer than I expected, no one daring to speak, my parents staring at me as though they were seeing me for the first time, their confusion and shock mingling with something else I had rarely glimpsed before: respect. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again, as though he was trying to summon some explanation, some way to twist the truth into something that didn't leave him exposed, but there was nothing he could say, because the facts were undeniable, and the entire table knew it. My grandmother went back to eating as though she hadn't just detonated a bomb, and I sat there, calm, steady, almost serene, because I realized that silence itself had become my answer, my shield, and my revenge all at once. I didn't gloat, I didn't make a speech, I didn't lean across the table and rub it in, because I understood in that moment that the most powerful statement was to say nothing at all. To let the truth stand on its own and force everyone else to rearrange the story they had been telling themselves for years. Daniel tried to change the subject, his voice tight and strained, but it was too late, because the damage had already been done, and the shift in the room was permanent. My parents looked at me differently, as though they were realizing all at once that the daughter they had spent years worrying about had outpaced the son they had always celebrated. And I could see in Daniel's eyes that his position as the unquestioned golden child had cracked in a way he would never fully recover from. After dinner, as people moved into the living room for coffee and dessert, I lingered at the table, letting the hum of conversation wash over me, and I thought about all the years I had spent swallowing my pride, all the tears I had shed in private, all the times I had wondered if maybe they were right about me, and I realized that every one of those moments had been leading to this. It wasn't about revenge in the dramatic sense. It wasn't about humiliating my brother or proving my parents wrong. It was about reclaiming the space I had been denied for so long. About knowing in my bones that I no longer needed anyone else's validation because I had already validated myself. Daniel didn't speak to me much that evening, and when he did his words were clipped, his tone sharper than usual, but I didn't mind, because the silence between us carried more weight than anything he could have said. He would never admit it, not out loud, not even years from now, but we both knew the truth, and for me that was enough. My grandmother gave me a small smile as she left, the kind that told me she had known exactly what she was doing with her question, and I felt a quiet gratitude toward her for being the one to say the words I didn't need to. As I drove home that night, the streets empty and quiet, I thought about how strange it was that something as simple as silence could feel more victorious than any fight, and I realized that I didn't need to script a final act, because the story had already written itself. I had spent years living as the afterthought, the one dismissed, the one underestimated, but in the end, I didn't need to scream to be heard. I didn't need to defend myself against every insult. I only needed to keep building until the truth was undeniable. And when the truth finally surfaced, it didn't just change how they saw me, it changed how I saw myself. What comes next between me and Daniel? I don't know, and maybe I don't even care, because what mattered most happened in that moment at the table, when silence finally worked in my favor, when years of dismissal collapsed under the weight of one simple fact. And when I learned that the most powerful revenge isn't always about saying something clever, but about saying nothing at all and letting the truth do the work for you.